Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream. Our special guest later on is David Scott, who I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, but I'll reintroduce David in just a minute or two. Family party events coming up. I'll do my normal announcements, which are very brief this time. The weekend after next, the 15th, 16th, 17th, I'm up in Orkney, Kirkwall, Stronsey as well. We're going to for a meeting, and we've got a meeting in Thurso as well on Saturday, the 17th of February. That's at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It'd be great to see you if you're in that area. Do come along. We would love to see you in the far, far north. And also on the same weekend, I think we've got street stalls in Elgin and Inverness. So that's going to be a fairly busy weekend. We had a lovely Sunday afternoon at Vision Church in Glasgow on this Sunday just gone as well. Mary, my wife, and I, and Neil Deepenrine as well, were there. We really enjoyed that. That's the church of David Richardson, who we've recently appointed as our deputy chairman. So, right, welcome back to David Scott. David, it's great to see you.
It's lovely to be back, Richard.
Now, we met for a cup of tea just before Christmas, didn't we, on Princess Street. We tried to meet in the Balmoral Hotel, but I don't think they quite realised who we were, so they told us that they were full. So we went to another hotel, and one of the many things we talked about was David must come on the live stream, because there's always got a lot of very interesting things to tell us about. So do you want to tell us about your latest project to start off with before we go into one of the issues?
Yeah, well, I'm running Northern Exposure now as a standalone journalism venture. So we've got lots on. So I've started writing on Substack. Look at a couple of these articles. So the Substack mail is called Digging Deeper NE. So you'll find all the written articles there. And I have started doing an analysis program called Notes from the Edge. And Note 1 has gone out. That's just an introduction. And Note 2 is about to go out shortly, which will be looking at the relationship between the Christian and the state. So hopefully some of your audience will be interested in that one. And I've also started an interview series called Necessarily So. The first one of those has gone out with Kevin Ryan, who's a 9/11 whistleblower. And the next episode is being recorded tomorrow with Alistair MacLeod, who is chief economist at Gold Money, and we'll be talking about money in banking and the economy and all of the difficulties that lie therein. And hopefully at the end of this month, I'll be starting the fourth part of this, which will be a weekly news review program, probably on a Sunday. And that's called Mad World. And there'll be a panel of people. And hopefully sometimes, Richard, you might join us as a guest for that one.
Yes,
to comment on the news and what's been happening in the world.
Yeah. The one thing I'd say about David's output, I think with online political, social commentary, quite a lot of the time you just get the same topics covered again and again and again. Okay, there might be a slightly different angle. I think what David's doing is like independent research into things that are really unique. And I normally read the things and think, wow, that's something I didn't know anything about before. And I've learned something here. That was really interesting. So I would recommend you keep up with what David's looking at. But this evening, sorry, go on.
So one final thing, actually, Richard, before we go on. We're also working with the survivors of Fornetti Residential School, and we've organised with them their second conference, which is at the weekend. So there will be full video from that conference, and this is going to have a lot of very interesting speakers at it, looking at the human rights aspects of this, the legal aspects, and also all of the research that we've been doing in the archives, which have been going on now for about 14 months all in. The first bit using FOI and then actually getting a researcher into the archives and seeing what we could find out. And we found out many, many interesting things. And some of the articles we're going to talk about here today, they're almost a spin-offs of the Fornetti research.
Yeah. But do you want to start off explaining a bit about Fornetti? I'd imagine some of the viewers are not familiar with the sorry tale.
Yeah, so Fornetti is located in Angus, but it was operated by Glasgow Corporation and then Strathclyde Regional Council as a residential school, part of a huge programme of residential schooling that Glasgow was operating as an experiment. So they would take children out of the city and they'd send them to rural locations for residential schooling for periods of maybe 6-8 weeks at a time. Now, they had some, must have been about a dozen of these schools. There was some on Bute, there were several up and down the Clyde coast. There was one in Dalguise near Pitlochry, and Fornetty is in Angus, up in one of the Angus glens near Ailith. So very rural location. It was gifted to the council by the Coates family, the Coates sisters of Paisley thread millionaire fame. They lived there, and when the last of the Coates sisters died, it was left to charitable use, to be used for the benefit of children. And so what happened was this process went on in all the Glasgow schools, where the headmaster or headmistress and the school medical officer would select children to be sent to Fornetty for these 6 or 8 week periods. And this was maybe children who had troubled family lives, or who were thin, or who were shy, or who were there wasn't a clear definition of what the criteria were, but up they went. So it was all girls, 74 at a time, and on a sort of rolling program, and they were sent up there to allegedly benefit their health. Now, Fornetty was a very unusual institution in that it was abusive from the day and hour it opened. Normally, these institutions start off genuinely trying to help children, and then the abusers are kind of drawn in to the opportunities that are there for them. But it wasn't that way with Fornetty, because it was abusive from the day and hour it opened. And it had one management regime for 30 years. And because it had this constant throughput of children, the total number who went there, something in the region of 20,000 little Glaswegian girls went through this institution. So it was all Protestant Glaswegian girls between the ages of 5 and 12 went there. And it was brutally abusive in every way possible. So we had physical abuse, emotional abuse of all sorts, casual cruelty included, but also sexual abuse. And we have traced several known sexual abusers as being regular visitors to Fornetty, including Sir Nicholas Fairbairn, including Shiny Bob Henderson, including Jimmy Savile, and other people that the audience will know, Rolf Harris, for example. So what appeared to be the one aspect of it is that the girls and the girls' school were being used on a regular basis for well-connected, often quite wealthy and rich abusers to get access to children. Now, the effect of all of this has been, rather than helping these little girls, the effects have been lifelong. So 6 weeks in this abusive environment has left trauma and scars that the women are dealing with 50 years later. Mm-hmm. So it's lifelong suffering that's been caused by this. We've been working now since, I think it was November 22, we started working with the Fornetty girls, doing research and finding out answers as to how this happened, what happened, and how it was all organised. Because Glasgow City Council, the successor body to the corporation and Strathclyde Regional Council, were not very helpful. They were just saying, well, we've got no records, we're sorry, we can't help. This wasn't really true. The records are a bit of a shambles, but there is information in there, and we've found out a great deal. And we're going to be presenting that to the ladies at the conference on the weekend. It's helping them a lot, finding out exactly what happened and why it happened, and it's allowing them to make sense of what they experienced. And it's a constant fight to try and get recognition for them from the authorities, who are really not interested. We're getting words, but we're not getting action. There was a debate in Parliament, and the Deputy First Minister spoke at it, and so did the head of the Liberal Democrats and other people from other parties. Shona Robinson said, this had been recognised and there would be support, but when it comes to practical help, it always seems to be not there. And whatever they ask for, the answer is no. So there's warm words. Oh yes, we feel your pain, and absolutely we'll support you in every possible way, apart from any of the ways that you actually ask for. Yeah, unfortunately.
Just a couple of questions. What date did it open again?
Opened in 1961, and it ran in this fashion to 1991.
1991. I've met a couple of the ladies who basically who were abused while they were there when they were children. And they explained to me that there's the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry. There's a lot of compensation being paid out to the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, but apparently they're not covered by it because they were still under the guardianship of their parents. The council had not taken over their guardianship. Therefore, for some reason, they didn't qualify for the compensation.
This is
still the case.
Well, this is what they were told by one Mr. John Swinney. And he looked them in the eyeball at one of the events in Parliament, and he told them this, that it was all voluntary. The parents it was only temporary, so it didn't really count in a funny kind of way. And either they were there with the parents' consent and still under the parents' direction, and somehow this meant that the authorities weren't responsible. Yes, every single word of that is a lie, and we can prove it. We can prove it from the files, from the records. We have the documentation. Everything that John Swinney said about the Fernetti girls was untrue. And we need the politicians to start facing facts. One of the difficulties, the strange difficulties, is that they have a narrative. And it's this, the problem that you cannot persuade someone of a fact if their salary depends on them not being persuaded. We have this. We have all of these officials who, at some significant expense to the taxpayer, are meant to be there to help the Fernetti girls, and they're not doing anything. And the story and narrative they're putting forward, the sort of thing that you just outlined, which is just not true. We're having to push hard and prove every statement to get them off the lie, to try and get them to the starting point for actually finding out what happened and how to move, and then the starting point for moving forward with the Fernetti girls. They're not really at the starting line yet. And this is the difficulty, because they won't engage with the reality of the situation. Right? And the reality of the situation is the state chose these children. The state told the parents they're going to Fernetti, and we'll get to just the amount of power the state wielded at the time shortly. And it was also a culture where people from working class families didn't generally argue with the state. When they went to Fernetti, they were absolutely in the care of the state. And everything that John Swinney says to the contrary is untrue. And they were used and abused in every way imaginable. And many of them have been left with emotional scars that are lifelong. And there should be some recognition now that the compensation scheme via the Child Abuse Inquiry comes with certain other issues to do with not being able to sue, and to do with silencing people, and to do with the small amounts of money involved, which are really inadequate anyway. So there are other issues. But to say to the Fernetti girls that somehow they're not really survivors of institutional abuse is ridiculous, and they see it as ridiculous because they know, right? They experienced it, they know it was abuse, and they know it was institutional abuse. There's no doubt in their minds; they're absolutely clear. And the difficulty is trying to get someone in authority to actually recognise the bleeding obvious.
Yeah. So just going back to the origin of the establishment. I mean, if it started off on this foot, was it created for this purpose? It does seem an unusual type of institution just to be providing temporary care. But I would imagine the origins are shrouded in the past. But do you believe it could have been set up for the purpose of abuse?
The origins are shrouded in the past, but we are uncovering quite a lot on this. It wasn't a one-off. It was part of an experiment that Glasgow Corporation were running with residential schooling. And they wanted to run this independently of all other organisations. It was a Glasgow initiative. It wasn't a nationwide initiative. And indeed, they weren't even asking advice or sharing information with anyone outside the city. It was very much a Glasgow thing. Mm-hmm. And there were many other institutions in this same category. Now, I've never heard anything negative about any of the other institutions.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that there wasn't anything, but I've never heard, no one's ever said that they'd been to one of these other ones and it was abusive. In fact, on the contrary, any information I've had on the other ones is actually they were very well run and were very caring and they were very good. Fonetti's an outlier. Now, there's some odd things happening here. Firstly, the woman who was the head mistress when it was founded died very shortly after the school was established. So it was left without leadership, and there was someone who was already on staff, was put in as temporary head, and who wasn't qualified for headship. But because she was in post, she was temporary for 3 years, and then it was made permanent because, sunset clause, and she came. And she stayed till long past her retirement. When they first made her permanent headmistress, she was past retirement. She stayed till long past her retirement, and she trained up a successor who ran it up until 1991. So it was one management system for that 30 years. Mm-hmm. And there's also some concern, like I don't want to go into this too much just at the moment, it's ongoing research, but that some of the people who were very senior in Glasgow City Council were looking at quite carefully just now. So could it be an intentional plan? Possibly, yeah. Or it could have been that there was an abuse already in the area. And when this school full of little Glaswegian girls came in, it immediately attracted an abuse network that was already there, and they found that the person with the ability and intellectual weight to actually run a school was dead, and someone else was put in charge who really wasn't capable, and there was an opportunity to exploit. Yeah. It could have been that.
Yeah. Now, the other institution I hear about is Quarriers, which is out to the west of Glasgow, isn't it? Is it?
Yes. Now, Quarriers is a more typical case in that it was set up under Christian principles. It was set up to give children who were orphans an upbringing and a life that was reasonably normal, and it had its own school, it had its own church, and it had a whole series of houses. And the idea was a house mother and a house father in each house, and a certain number of children would be assigned to each house, and they'd be looked after by these surrogate parents, not quite adoptive, but substitute parents. And that was the process. Now, it became more and more abusive, and this was a case of people who wanted to abuse children being drawn towards where children were. And it became a bit of a lottery, I understand, which house you were in, whether it was abusive or not. And this went on and got worse and worse. And the abuse was severe. I have a certain amount of personal interest in this because my cousin died in Quarriers under questionable circumstances of a cerebral hemorrhage when he was around 15 years of age. And this was before I was born, but it was a great loss to the family who had got him in there thinking this was a fine Christian place for someone who was in a difficult situation, and they thought they were doing their best by him. And it was not the case. So yes, Quarriers has got a lot of problems as well, but it's not quite the same as Fernetti, and it seemed to be gradually evolving into an abusive situation as abusers were attracted towards children, as sadly they always are.
Yeah. With Quarriers closed long ago. I happen to know someone who lives there now. So it's all converted into housing. The campus is very nice. I know someone who lives there. Now, one of the other things you've been doing your research on was the culture in Scotland in the longer ago than I'd ever considered. In any case, about the systems for taking children from parents in quite an unrestrained way, quite a cavalier way. Is that the word? Cavalier. Yeah.
Well, this shocked me. This came out of the Fernetti research, and I mean, I thought I knew a bit about this. I've been through the No to Name Person campaign. I thought I understood a reasonable amount, and I was still genuinely shocked. So this is the article's called "Coming Up the Clyde in a Banana Boat," and it refers to the Clyde report. So James L. Clyde KC, the Clyde Committee, was a 1946 committee on homeless children. Right. So their remit was, I'll quote here, quote, to inquire into the existing methods of providing for children deprived of normal home life and to consider what further measures could be taken to compensate them for lack of parental care. Now, this the introduction to this was, well, we've learned through the war that children need families because of the whole disruption of family life from evacuations. This is a strange thing because surely we knew before the war that children need families. I don't think that was new information. And they then go and they essentially, the Clyde committee's view on this is that we'll create synthetic families, substitute families, and that'll be fine. That'll work fine. So there's a report on this by Professor Kenneth Mackenzie Norrie of University of Strathclyde, and he described it as follows. He said, state provision of substitute families, which would replace the unsatisfactory families from which the young persons had been removed, was therefore seen as a primary solution to the lack of parental care. The report's preference was for foster parents over institutional care, and this is underpinned by the belief, which may strike the modern reader as naive, that parental affection would always be an inherent part of care offered by those fostering children. And Norrie concludes the aim of this went into an act, right? So the aim of the 1932, 1937, and 1948 Act, and the 48 Act was influenced by the Clyde report, was to ensure that the child would be provided with family life by the state, just not with their own family. So this was the viewpoint, right? So family life's essential, but it doesn't really matter who you get. As long as it looks like family life, it's fine. And this seems to so totally miss the point about what families are, about the unique bond between parents and children. It just misses it all, quite extreme fashion.
I mean, that's similar to the system today, isn't it? I mean, if parents are genuinely unsuitable or incapable for some reason, then foster parents or adoption are the right answer. How is that different than the system today?
It's very similar to the system today, right? This is one of the concerning things. The system today, which is based on. One of the questions asked in the article is how much did all of this influence the belief systems that are ingrained in social services and other parts of the state today, the attitudes towards families, the attitudes towards parents, the attitudes towards families that might be a bit unconventional, that might be a bit poorer than the middle class professional people might like, right? Or whose lifestyle might not be what they expect. Right? They're involving themselves in family life because the families don't meet their standards, not because the families don't meet the children's standards, not because the families aren't much better than the alternative of state care.
Yeah,
they're getting involved where they should never get involved. So what came out of the research in this was that the power that was taken by the Clyde Committee and by the 1948 Act was really quite horrendous, because every local authority had to set up a children's committee, and these children's committees could pass a parental rights resolution and remove the child from his or her parents. And it was then up to the parents to go to court to try and reverse the situation.
Yeah, I mean, that's bizarre, isn't it? The process to take the children away is merely administrative, but the process to get them back is legal.
Yes,
that's just bizarre, isn't it?
Right, now, that was the law. I didn't know this. That was the law in Scotland from 1948. Okay. Now, the reason that they could take them away, if the parents were of such habits or mode of life as to be unfit to have the care of the child. So, pretty vague, right? No court was involved. There was no standards of evidence. And Norrie, who I mentioned before, reported on this. He said there were antecedents in English law, but none in Scots law for institutions taking over parental rights without a court process. Now, even though there had been the poor laws in England had been somewhat similar, and there was an equivalent investigation in England called the Curtis Report. Now, the Curtis Report, although there was legal precedent in England for this, the Curtis Report said, quote, "We think it objectionable that the rights of a parent or other guardian could be extinguished by a mere resolution of a council." So in England, it was objectionable. In Scotland, it was law, and it was written into legislation. And worse than that, it was essentially, there's another act in 1968 that kept it. That was on the books until 1995. Right, and one of the issues about this that really concerns me is, well, there's two issues. One is, how much arrogance did that breed in social workers and others in the state sector towards parents? If they knew that the law was they could have a vote and take your children. And secondly, how much fear did it breed in the parents? Right? Because the implication is, we're from the government and we're here to help, and we've got some advice for you about how you should bring up your children. Right? Now, the unstated part, if they could just have a vote and take your kids, is you better take our advice. Yeah.
So what's coming out here is that the culture of state overreach, a cavalier approach to family life by the state, thinking they could take children without proper processes, without sufficient, adequate processes. There's something that's been ingrained for, well, many, many decades, but which raises the question. I would have thought, if we were going back to this sort of era, I'd have thought Scotland would be a bastion of common sense on these issues. So,
well,
how did that happen? How did they end up going deviating from the path that England was taking in this regard? I can't think of anything I'm aware of in Scottish culture at the time that would have resulted in that.
It surprised me It surprised me that that was ever a law.
Mm-hmm.
It surprised me that there wasn't more pushback against it. It shocked me that it was still in the books in 1995. I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was a parent by this point. I didn't know anything about this.
Well, basically, people, the general population doesn't take an interest in this sort of legislation, doesn't it? Same with the act that gives children medical consent and confidentiality from age 12. I mean, that passed without any controversy at all. Is it just that the population is not interested in this sort of thing?
In part, maybe. Is it disinterest? Is it naivety? Is it some sort of? Is it a faith in their government? Right, substitute God. Government is God, so you're not going to doubt your God. I'm not quite sure where it comes from. Now, one of the interesting bits in this, the research for this article, I found there's a chap called Stephen Cretney, who's known as the father of English family law. And he's quite good, and he's certainly a top man in his field. And he said almost every piece of family legislation in the past century has actually worked out in a way radically different from the policy presented to the legislature as justifying the legislation in question, and has often had results quite different from those which the initiators intended. That is the top man in English family law. And he's saying none of it works as advertised.
Mm-hmm.
All of the reasons when they go to Holyrood and say, oh, we're going to wring our hands, oh, we need to do something about this. It's the compassionate thing to do. It's the moral thing to do. If you oppose this, you're immoral. Mm-hmm. And the people who are opposing it saying, no, we can see many, many unintended consequences and risks here. And the response is, oh, no one would ever do that. We're here to help children. We're just full of love for them.
Yeah.
No, that's wrong. That is not how it works out. It works out completely differently from the way that's advertised when the legislation goes through. Yeah. And that's the father of English family law saying that, not me.
Yeah. But it's interesting. The named persons scheme really did generate opposition. I know you were involved in that a lot. I mean, it really did generate opposition. It captured public interest, didn't it? But that was very much against the run of play. Normally, this sort of thing doesn't. But,
well,
you see that so extreme.
Partly, but I think it's more than that. When in the United States of America in the 1960s, when we got involved in the Vietnam War, when it was an all-volunteer army, and only the army families were suffering the losses, the country didn't care. When middle-class families whose sons and daughters were going to Ivy League universities were getting call-up papers to go and fight in Vietnam, then there was rioting in the streets. And it's because it came for everybody. It came for every family. Now, something like the legislation there where a council committee could decide to take your kids. Oh, by the way, the parents only had a month to object. If you didn't object to them in a month, that was it. There was no way back, no legal way back. And so the position was horrendous on the part of parents. But they would only go for a few people, be a few families, maybe a little bit different, maybe who believe different things, or maybe who were a bit isolated or poor or dirty or whatever their problem was. So it wouldn't go for everybody. Nice middle-class families with conventional, ordinary views wouldn't get targeted. Now, named person, it was everybody. And the whole point was it's everybody because otherwise somebody would fall through the net, was how they justified it. All right. Yeah. So it was everybody got this extra parent who was above the actual parents and who was going to gather information on every aspect of your family and decide on their gut feel whether intervention was required. That scared people because it was everybody would have one and you couldn't escape it.
Yeah.
And it was, I think, when people are able to conclude it will never happen to me. Right? Now they're not right, they're wrong, because it can happen to you, but you just got to be unlucky, right? If you actually cross the wrong person who's in power and authority under those circumstances, you can be in a terrible situation.
Yeah, or if you cross your own children, because the culture now is you listen to the children, whatever the children say, you treat that as gospel and go from there. So I think that's another fear for parents.
Well, this is turning children against the parents. This is totalitarianism, and the nature of the named person was a Stasi. It was gathering information from everybody. Everybody could be an informer. Your neighbor could be an informer. Everybody could be an informer. Yeah. Your child has a tantrum or something that makes a lot of noise. It just takes someone to lift the phone and report that to the named person, and it's away at the races, and you wouldn't know.
Yeah, it's interesting with the named person. I mean, the legislation it was actually repealed quite recently. Actually, it was finally repealed. So that system has gone, but I mean, the spirit behind it is very much alive and well in the Scottish government and the associated establishment as well. It just comes through in different ways now.
The legislation is gone, but the named persons haven't gone.
They exist in some councils, I think.
They exist in some councils on a non-statutory basis. That means you can tell them to get lost. All right, so they say, "Hello, I'm your child's named person." No, this is not something I'm going to have anything to do with. You can do that.
But that can still count against you. I think the legislation was about the data sharing aspect, wasn't it? I still think in councils areas where there's a named person, and in council areas where there's not, there's still the same attitudes and spirit is still there. I still think if a parent doesn't cooperate with them, that named person or equivalent isn't going to say, "Oh, okay, fair enough. They don't want any help. They'll think, right, this is yet another concern."
Well, this is the thing, right? Because everything becomes made into a problem. Everything becomes criminalized. Normal family life can become criminalized under the suspicious eye of the state. All right, so I was probably too blasé. I mean, you can tell them to get lost, but you have to do it very carefully, and you have to do it in the right way, in such a way that they will not come after you. And it is a risk, but they still exist, right? So I someone contacted me just a few days ago to say, their daughter's just had a child and somewhat difficult family life, and it pops this person and said, "I'm your daughter's named person." Right, so this is still going on, and after the named person legislation was initially ruled unlawful, you have to remember they rolled it out into professional practice before it even passed through the Parliament, let alone got royal assent, and so it was operating, and it was harming people. And there was a petition put to the Parliament. What are you going to do about the people you have already harmed with your unlawful legislation? And that petition hung around for a couple of years, and then it was closed because they felt they could. Right? They didn't. At no point did they engage with a significant issue, which is it's been ruled unlawful, and you've been doing it for the past 4 years. What are you going to do to undo the harm?
Yeah. I mean, soon after the named person scheme, the Scottish government proposed a redefinition of child abuse. This is a few years ago now. It was maybe even 5 years ago. It was absolutely appalling. It was things like making a child feel that their views are not valued, making a child feel rejected, totally subjective, just the everyday, a day of everyday life in an average family would tick several of the boxes. And it's just inviting children to complain about their parents. And these things were so subjective that were you made to feel rejected? This sort of thing. Completely, absolutely bonkers. Now, when that first came out, I dug it up on the Parliament website. I made a video about it. And I think it was maybe a few other people as well expressed concerns, but it seems to have just disappeared. And I wonder if the Scottish government might have thought, we don't really fancy like named person Mark II battle over this. And I think it's disappeared. But you've got to think that the existing legislation is from the 1930s, I think. So surely they are going to want to update it, but they've backed off it for now.
Yeah.
But any time now, that could come back. It really was appalling.
It often sits on the shelf for several years.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it finally comes forward, it's presented to us. We've been working on this for a long time. It's now accepted that this is the way forward.
Mm-hmm.
And all right-thinking people support this. And look, we've got all these charities, the ones that we pay for. They're all right behind us. I mean, Bernardo's children's charities, they love it, and Abelard Trust, and they all say it's the right thing. So it must be right because the charities say so.
Because every single government-funded charity agrees with it, so it must be right.
Yes, exactly. And this is how the appearance of broad support is created. The appearance of consensus and fake grassroots are created, and then it's pushed forward. And then you get the consultation document is normally what comes along next, which is written in such a way as to only ask the questions they want to hear the answer to.
Mm-hmm.
And the consultation document to name person was very interesting because the institutions, the ones that take the government coin, they were wholeheartedly in favour. And the actual people who responded, they were like 95% against. And they did recognise this, but it didn't stop it because obviously they don't listen to the people because that's not what democracy is all about.
No. Yeah, so this child abuse redefinition, we just keep an eye open for that. As you say, it could well be back. Right, we've given those issues a very good area. That's an interesting historical insight into the development of this philosophy in Scotland. But another issue you've been looking at has been, as one I've looked at as well, is the re-emergence of eugenics in Scotland, particularly through the National Health Service.
Yeah, so this was another shocker, right? Because this is from 1960. So we're talking 15 years after the British Army liberated Belsen. Okay? And all of the horrors of the Nazi regime came out. And I had assumed, naively, that would kill any idea of eugenics thought for at least a generation. I was wrong. So here we have this article is called Eugenics in the NHS. So this is a speech given by Colonel R.S. Weir, a Lanarkshire County Councillor and President of the Scottish Association of Executive Councils of the National Health Service. And he addressed that body's annual meeting. And he said the following: much has been said of the deterioration of our blood stock by the preservation of the unfit and undesirables. Their elimination would be a blessing, but education has far to go before people will consent to this. So complete eugenics thought, full on, we need to eliminate the unfit. We decide who they are, and they're toast. And he says it will take 30 or 40 years, this is in 1960, before public opinion can be educated to see that such a step would benefit the body politic. Obviously, the most vigorous opposition would come from some sections of the church. And he then goes...
Now, didn't Hitler have the same complaint, actually? Didn't he complain that the church was a pain in the neck when it came to putting in place his policies as well? I'm pretty sure he did. He complained about that. Anyway, carry on.
Colonel Weir goes on, let us put aside the question of cost, although this is not trifling, and think on the misery, the ever-present burden in the home blighted by the child moron or the senile defective. That would be your mother or your father, I guess. And he goes on and says, basically they'd be better off dead. Now, I thought, wow, that was reported. That was reported in was it the Scotsman? It was at a fancy conference at Turnberry. I think it was the Scotsman reported it. And it was in the mainstream press, and nobody reacted. Right? I mean, he could say this, and he wasn't shouted down. People listened. People thought this was a good address. I was shocked, so I went looking for other examples of what was happening in the 1960s, and yet it wasn't alone. So I found Sir Julian Huxley of UNESCO fame. He gave the Eugenics Society's Galton Lecture in London in '62, Eugenics in Evolutionary Perspective. All right, and he basically described the Nazi regime as the reductio ad horrendum of racism of Nazi Germany, and it was one of those unfortunate events. So he kind of dismissed it, right? That was a mistake. We don't want to do that. And then he said, new ideas and attitudes about reproduction and parenthood in particular, and human destiny in general. One of those new ideas will be the moral imperative of eugenics. So he was, again, just 17 years on from the horrors of Nazi Germany being uncovered, he was again pushing eugenics. And he came up with another one that was new to me. He was talking about the pioneers of EID. EID stands for eugenic insemination by donor.
Right.
Right. So he said the pioneers of EID, while its publicists or practitioners will undoubtedly suffer all kinds of abusive prejudice. They will be accused of mortal sin, of theological impropriety, of immoral and unnatural practices. But they can take heart from what's happened in the field of birth control. They can be confident that the rational control of reproduction aimed at the prevention of human suffering and frustration and the promotion of human well-being, there's that word again, well-being, and fulfillment will be in the not too distant future, it will come to be recognized as a moral imperative. So he thinks he can turn this around and get people to see this is substitute, this is good becomes evil, right? This is eugenic insemination by donor, replacing having families, having children, right, is amongst the most horrendous ideas. He said, no, it will come to be seen as a good thing. Now, when you see these evils being placed on a society, they are always being put forward as moral and good and kind and all of these things.
Yeah. I mean, in Scotland, I don't know if you're familiar with the Glasgow Royal Fertility Clinic. It's in the NHS hospital in Glasgow. You could go along and you can basically get your sperm or egg, and you can choose from a catalogue. Basically,
Yes.
It's from EU countries, so it's got the price tag. You can see a photograph of the person. It tells you what they're good at. There's a little recorded message from the interview with the person. There's a written message from them, and you can choose the qualities and capabilities and the appearance that you'd like for your own child. I mean, absolutely clear-cut, no ifs and buts eugenics, and yet it's absolutely taken for granted there. I mean, the Scottish government as well is pushing its egg donation thing hugely. They're spending hundreds of thousands on advertising campaigns to try to get young women to donate eggs. And it's as though it's like donating blood as far as the government's concerned. You're just donating some tissue that someone else needs. And there's nothing more to it than that. So they're completely blind to the moral implications of it. But I think with that, I think a pushback's beginning. There's certainly a bit of a campaign growing against surrogacy. Have you come across that?
Yes. And, the horrors of that. I think the sight of well-heeled middle-class homosexual men taking children off of poor women for money is starting to make people feel that this is not the way to go. Yeah. So I think that's gathering pace. I mean, surrogacy is just point blank illegal in, I can't remember the list, but a good number of European countries just ban it completely. So the UK is a bit out of sync probably with the European norm on the issue. So I came across a work from 1922 from Roman Catholic polemicist G.K. Chesterton called Eugenics and Other Evils. Now, this is a free. It's a free PDF online, and there's an audio book which you can get on YouTube. And if anyone's interested in these subjects, it's a joy to listen to or read. He's very, very astute and makes his points with real gusto. I'll give you a quick quote here. He says, "Most eugenicists are euphemists. I mean merely that short words startle them, whilst long words soothe them. They are utterly incapable of translating the one into the other. However, obviously, they mean the same thing. Say to them, the persuasive and even coercive powers of the citizen should enable him to make sure that the burden of longevity in the previous generation does not become disproportionate and intolerable, especially to the females. Say this to them, and they will sway slightly to and fro like babies sent to sleep in cradles. Say to them, murder your mother, and they will sit up quite suddenly, yet the two sentences in cold logic are exactly the same." So this is very important because this is how it's put forward, the way that the language is used. And I'll just give you one other very short quote from Chesterton. He said, "The act of founding the family, I repeat, was an individual adventure outside the frontiers of the state. And if I could have that chiseled onto the Parliament building, I would."
That's tempting, isn't it? It's tempting to get a chisel, do it for him. My favourite G.K. Chesterton quote with regard to the state and family is, he says, "Trying to replace parents, or mothers in particular, with state childcare. It's like going out into your garden when it's pouring with rain, holding up an umbrella to keep the water off the plants, and then watering them with a watering can."
Yeah.
Which is,
he's not wrong.
That's a good one.
Sorry, on you go.
If you've got something else on this topic, then fire
away.
Well,
just before I go, I finished looking at where we are now, and amongst many other things, I focused on abortion and with particular reference to Downs. So what's happening there is really shocking, and it's completely eugenics and homicidal. One woman, Emma Mellor, said, "We must have been offered 15 terminations. At 30 weeks, they made it really, really, really clear that if I changed my mind on the morning of the induction, to let them know because it wasn't too late until the baby had started traveling down the birth canal, I could still terminate." This is the sort of pressure that's been put on parents to have their Down syndrome children killed in the womb. And that's where we're at.
The BBC did an article a while ago saying, Iceland eliminates Down syndrome. What fantastic medical breakthrough with this. Well, the medical breakthrough is they kill them all.
Yes.
So they're eradicated. I was talking to someone just the other day who was telling the story that during her pregnancy, they detected some sort of abnormality or some sort of problem. And they really, like you were saying there, suggested again and again and again, you really basically said you really should have an abortion. And she didn't. And the child was absolutely fine. Absolutely fine.
This is a story we hear very often. And even if, and we also hear children who are not absolutely fine, who have serious medical challenges, but make it through, right? And they maybe have 4 years of very, very poor health and operations and this, that, and the other. But they then make it through and they have a full and healthy life, and they're completely written off by the medical profession. And it's just not true.
Right, we've just got time to watch a little clip of Humza Yousaf being interviewed about his plans to increase productivity in Scotland. Now, everyone watching this, so you can type your comments in as we're watching. Does Humza Yousaf have a clue what he's talking about? Just listen to this. It's sort of funny, but it's quite concerning as well.
In our speech on this in Glasgow University on my vision for industrial policy, and a lot of it is centred on the huge potential we've got from the transition to net zero.
And just remind us, what is productivity in Scotland? What is your vision on how you're going to turn around productivity in Scotland?
So I just did an hour speech on this in Glasgow University on my vision for industrial policy, And a lot of it is centred on the huge potential we've got from the transition to net zero.
And just remind us, what is productivity in Scotland? How does it rank compared to productivity in England? Where's it been for the last 17 years?
So
of
productivity has
FMP?
increased at a faster rate than the rest of the UK in the last decade, but it's still far too low. It's nowhere near where we need it to be. And for me, the unlocking
And when you say
of that,
it increased by faster amount, it's still tiny.
I'm accepting that, by the way. I'm not disagreeing with you. It's
yeah.
far too low than it should be. And I go back to my point, our fiscal monetary lever is largely controlled by the UK. But look, I accept also.
You think the productivity is defined by the fiscal and monetary levers? You think?
Look, it can often be by the fact that we don't have, for example, if I took the example of transitioning to net zero, the way we unlock that is largely actually how the United States and Europe are doing it. You need to be able to compete, not with the quantum of the Inflation Reduction Act, the European Green Deal Investment Plan. What you're going to have to do is put some sort of subsidy up, like actually the Labour Party seem to be suggesting and now rolling back on, to unlock that investment. Most of my meetings in London.
So you mean you want to put tens of billions of pounds into investing in some green future, and you're going to have to borrow it?
That's absolutely part of it.
And you're frustrated because you can't borrow tens of billions
we
of
can't
pounds.
borrow even close to tens of billions of
And you
pounds.
think Britain would be able to suddenly borrow that money in its current financial situation?
Yes, I think they should absolutely prioritise that. Remember, of course, politics is about choices, and then you can make those choices when you're in government. Now, whether you have to borrow, whether you have to look at taxation. In Scotland, we've taken a different route on taxation, where those who earn the most, like First Ministers, pay a little bit more because we need to invest in our public services. Whatever choices you have to make,
but your instinct
you have
is,
to look at the longer term.
your instinct is, if you borrowed more or taxed more, got more money, and the government pushed that money in the way that Europe or the US has done, you'd be able to get productivity turned around.
I don't doubt that would have a significant impact on our economy, including in terms of productivity. I don't doubt it for a minute, because the meetings that I've had throughout the entire course of yesterday with some of the biggest investors in the world, and many of them have a footprint in Scotland already, or BlackRock's, JP Morgan's, Morgan Stanley's, Barclays, all big investors globally, and all of them have an interest in investing in Scotland due to the climate renewable potential. Our difficulty, and there's things that the Scottish Government absolutely can do, we have some recommendations from an investor panel, but ultimately the key message that keeps coming back is, well, look, why would we invest in the UK when we're getting subsidy incentives in the United States or in European capitals?
Alex, Nicola.
I'm curious why Rory's making the
Yeah,
face.
I'm making a face because it doesn't sound to me like productivity. I mean, it sounds to me like these people are saying we can get free money from these other governments. But what I was expecting you to do is much more what you hear from Andy Burnham or Andy Street, which is laying out concrete, detailed plans on how to improve productivity in their regions. And I was expecting you to talk much more about skills. I was expecting you to talk much more about specific forms of industrial strategy. This idea that somehow what's holding back productivity is the inability to find tens of billions of pounds, which incidentally, I don't think Britain could borrow. I don't think we're in the financial situation to do that. In a sense, that was the Liz Truss lesson.
Yeah.
We're not the world's reserve currency. We don't have the freedom to do those things.
Look, productivity.
You get the idea. I mean, has he got a clue what he's talking about?
No, not a clue. Productivity is governed by, more than anything else, by capital investment. Right? We need to get capital investment into providing better tools so that people can produce more. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not even about skills so much. Skills is part of it, but principally it's about capital investment. You want to produce more capital investment.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you get capital investment? Well, you got to give people a return, right? And you got to do some. I mean, if he was talking about the banking system, that would be one thing. Maybe the idea that we'll screw interest rates to zero and disincentivize savings means that there's no resources for investment. Maybe that's a very, very bad thing, but you wouldn't get Humza talking about that. You wouldn't get Humza talking about monetary policy. All he's talking about is fiscal monetary levers. In other words, borrowing and taxation. Now, if you tax it, you're stealing money from somebody to give it to somebody else. So he wants to steal money from the people who are watching this broadcast, and he wants to give it to BlackRock. That's what he said. So BlackRock will come and produce some sort of green electricity that is more expensive, because if it wasn't, we'd be doing it anyway. So we're going to get more expensive power, which is one of the basic inputs, and that will make us less productive. Well done, Hamza. Genius.
Yeah, it was just bizarre. It's as though he's got the conversation piece that, you know, we're going to invest in net zero, and that's going to improve the economy and productivity. I mean, does he even really believe that? Or is he so used to operating in Scotland where you can get away with giving such sort of facile answers and they go unchallenged? That's just the common currency of political debate in Scotland, that he just thinks that's going to do the trick. But I think he was really found out there. And it's not just like politically, it's just concerning that he's running the country. I've been saying about Humza Yousaf, I was watching him in the COVID inquiry, I've thought it before. It's as though he's acting the part. He's found himself as First Minister because he's had the golden ticket. He's the diversity hire. So he's become First Minister, and he needs to look like he's doing the job. So he needs to learn the right sort of lines, the right sort of language, the way to conduct himself. And he can manage that. But what he can't do is understand what's going on and have any sort of insightful thoughts, any incisive thoughts on the issues of the day. I mean, in a sense, I feel sorry for him. He must feel, you know, Nicola Sturgeon used to talk about imposter syndrome. I mean, Humza Yousaf must have that for real.
Oh, I think it was real with Nicola as well, to be fair. I saw there was a hard-working working class gentleman down in England had written on the back of his van, it's okay, there is no climate crisis. The net zero everyone's talking about is the average IQ inside Westminster. I thought that was actually quite accurate, right? You know, because these are not the cleverest people in any room. And the idea, he goes on about net zero, it's an incantation, right? What's it meant to mean? How does net zero increase productivity? Right?
We're going to have our cake and eat it, isn't it?
Well, yes, or we're going to have more jobs because it's less efficient, right? Yeah. Because it's going to take more effort to make the same amount of electricity. Yeah. Therefore, everything's less efficient, but it'll take more people, so it'll generate jobs. Now, there was the comparison point for that was there was a town in the middle of America, and it had two railway lines, and they didn't meet. Right, one railway terminated one side of town, and the other railway started at the far side of town. Mm-hmm. So when goods were being transported, they had to offload the train, put them on trucks, drive them across town, and reload the train. And then there was a scheme to join up the railway. And someone said, "Well, you can't do that. Look at all the jobs we'd lose from all these people driving the trucks and offloading and reloading the train." And of course, the pushback was, well, yeah, we should have a virtual railroad. We don't have any tracks. We just have an endless chain of people offloading and reloading trains. And think of the jobs we'd generate. You know, everyone in the country would be employed. And this is the mindset.
Why do you actually need the trucks? Could not the people just like pass them hand to hand along?
Well, exactly. So, you know, this is the mindset of Humza. He doesn't know what productivity is. He doesn't know what efficiency is. I mean, goodness sake, you know, take a look at the Scottish government. You see that. How many people have they hired? Right? They're doing less and less with more and more. They are the very opposite of efficiency. If he knows what productivity is, so let's start seeing it in government.
Yeah. And on that note, I'd like to thank you very much, David, for coming on. That was fascinating as ever. We'll look forward to welcoming you back sometime in the future, maybe to take part in one of our live events as well somewhere. And I will look forward to appearing on one of your projects as well before too long. But
we do plan to do that. Thank you very much for having me, Richard. It's been a real pleasure. I'd be happy to come along to anything you've got planned as well. And next article is coming out is on child guidance and the idea of the dangerous age of childhood. So perhaps that's one that your members will also like to read.
Certainly. Right, thanks everyone for watching, live or later on. Thanks for your comments as well. I didn't get to many of them, but appreciate those. Oh, I saw a Twitter comment come up as well. Because I thought you couldn't comment on Twitter, but they must have been Twitter X, sorry. But they must have changed it so you can do that now. So if you watch on X, it looks like you can now comment. So, right, good night, everyone, and see you next week. Good night.